All right, I'm not a fan of what's these days called something like classical education, which is not really about classics. It's kind of this idea that there's sort of um, a Western civilization that's worth preserving, right? And in a previous talk, we talked about how Western civilization is anti-civilization. So obviously it's not worth preserving, and I forgot to mention there, you know, explicitly that, if your whole mentality, your whole moral framework is based on freedom, personal freedom, liberty, and rights, that kind of cannibalizes each other, right? People are like, I have the right to have a dog, right? And I'm like, I have the right to have peace, right? So this dog starts barking, and then now there's a conflict, right? Because it's not about personal property, it's not about a way and such, right? So if you look at Western civilization, it's not really worth preserving. Okay, you can look at that discussion if you were interested in that. But one, what is Western civilization? If you look at that, it's not something you necessarily want to preserve. Two, if you do want to teach people what Western civilization is in a educational framework, like a structured educational framework, not just talking about it, right, in a book or in a podcast or whatever, right? But if you're just actually having a high school built on this for 4 years, right? It's kind of a trend these days, or had been, until maybe the energy and money and financing ran out. But we have this kind of idea that you have like, this Western canon, right? So you read, that's one way to go about it, right? You have a canon, you have a set of books that you read, and then you educate what it means, what Western civilization is and means, and what it values. And then from there, you go forth, and then you are a highly educated person, right? That's the idea. But if you look at this is a very flawed understanding, okay? Because one, if you think about this idea of a canon, you have to choose certain books. But if you look at the most important books that you could put in a so-called Western canon, you're going to actually fill that maybe literally half at least with criticisms of the West. All right. So if you look at possibly the most single famous piece of philosophy in Western history, it is going to be Plato's Republic. And what is that? That it contains tons of criticisms against what we might consider Western civilization. Okay. It's at least 50% directly and indirectly a criticism of democracy. Okay. And what you find in there are some things that are very useful, but it's not necessarily agreed with by the time you get to Aristotle. So Socrates teaches Plato, Plato writes these works, Plato also teaches Aristotle, Aristotle writes his works, and there's disagreement. Okay? There's already a disagreement. And that's even its own lineage, right? So if you're not thinking about philosophers' lineage, you're just kind of looking out everywhere, we have very harsh criticisms of what you might consider Western civilization. Okay. So a classical education, ironically, does not actually focus on any kind of set of classics. Okay. I once visited a so-called classical school, and their textbooks were just a bunch of stuff like, I don't know, their physics textbooks didn't have equations in it. Their physics textbooks didn't, they had these questions like, does a Holy Spirit have mass? Questions like that. I mean, what is that, right? That's not really anything substantive. Okay. So, I forget what the school was called. It's um, yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was in Highlands Ranch, in Colorado. But anyways, this one is not a very well thought out program. Okay, you shouldn't study the Western canon for two reasons. One, this is not a civilization worth preserving, and two, there's no set of books that you could really rely on to have a sense of preserving civilization. Okay, so there's no real canon. And that leads me to something else, which is you shouldn't study a so-called Eastern canon either. Okay. Even even the notion of a Confucian canon should be debated, okay? But certainly you do not want to have a concept of a so-called Eastern canon. Why? Because it's the same problems there that afflicts the third reason you shouldn't have a Western canon, which is the texts will conflict with each other. Okay, the texts will conflict with each other. So you look at, you look at Confucianism, it's very much in conflict with a lot of Buddhism, a lot of Taoism, right? A lot of legalism. There's some overlaps, but there's a lot of sometimes direct criticism. And simply the ideas at a certain point are mutually incompatible. They're mutually exclusive. Okay. And same thing with the West. I mean, what is this, right? You have lots of different ideas. Okay. You have the Stoics, you have Christianity, you have, you know, the Sophists, you have the Platonists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so is there a certain set of books that are recommended? Yes, but you don't have to make it about the Western canon or the Eastern canon. Just recommend those books.